Okay, we're looking at the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's what we landed upon. Since we decided we were only going to do 5, or I decided, I guess, we were only going to do 5 of the Narnia Chronicles. Then the difficult and unhappy decision of which to leave out, which is in part solved by which 5 to leave in, for me, it's easy to do 4 of them, and then it becomes harder after that, because I will definitely have to do the 2 we already did, The Magician's Nephew. It just provides a different, it's the prehistory of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And then for me, The Silver Chair and The Last Battle are very important, particularly The Last Battle, but The Silver Chair, I think, is a sort of an epic. I'll get to that, and deals with all sorts of issues that arise elsewhere, and I think is a very good book as well, The Silver Chair. And so then it's between the other 3. I love A Horse and His Boy. It just doesn't seem to fit the same way. It seems a little odd, like, what's going on here, and why are we suddenly in a Middle Eastern context, and what's being said here with that? And we could get into that, but it seems a little bit more remote from the other topics. And then it comes down to Caspian and this one. And I just find that this one is a little bit more interesting because it explores what is picked up in The Last Battle, and some have suggested that Lewis thought he was done when he came to write The Last Battle because he'd done this already. He'd come to the end of the world, right? So you think, okay, that's the last word on the end of Narnia. It's presented here, and that's one reason I'm doing this. I see this as Alan Jacobs, who's written a very good biography of Lewis called The Narnian, sees it. I see this as an allegory of the church, because it talks about, so we've already looked at the creation, we looked at redemption, the first 2 books we looked at. Here is about the role of the church and the effect of the church in dealing with, even with unbelievers. We have a moment of conversion in this that is more extraordinary than we see elsewhere. It's not really dealt with in any of the other books up till now. Not really. We don't get a scene of redemption per se. We get the crucifixion, obviously, of Aslan, but not a person, as it were, converting. But we do get that here in the person of Eustace Scrubb. And the Dawn Treader is a ship, and the ship has historically, in Christian thought, been taken as a metaphor for the church. So some have read, if you read allegorically, you read the Noah's Ark as a sort of prototype of the church, and so forth. I'm not warm to that reading of Noah, but it's still there. And as far as this goes, it seems very suitable in some ways. And also it's interesting to look at Eustace Scrubb in light of the other characters on it, because he's a very dislikable character. And you wonder what he's even doing there, because he gets dragged through the picture, if you recall at the beginning of the novel, along with the other 2 children who we know believe in the lion and what he represents, and he simply does not. He rejects it, and he, of course, also represents the product of progressive education, which Lewis explicitly talks about here. And so it fits with what I've been saying so far in the course about this great interest that Lewis has in education that's represented everywhere in his own writing, from his particular views on literary criticism, to his views on the canon of literature, to his views on decisive shifts in the humanities and in the university, which he talked about in De Descriptione Temporum. Where do we see turning points? So where we see the turning points depends to some degree on what our view of human nature is, but also what our view of truth is. And where the truth is best represented and so forth. And so I presented to you at the time, and I still see it that way, that Lewis's De Descriptione Temporum is a very important work in helping us situate his own literary criticism, so his work as an academic, but also how he portrays modern education as opposed to the education that he had, which is, for lack of a better word, a classical education. I mean, he studied classics, so I guess it's not really a stretch for me to say that. As I say, it's called Greats at Oxford, so he read Latin and Greek in the original and wrote about the works and so forth. It's surprising to people to learn that Lewis did not study English literature, despite end up teaching it. In fact, he didn't study it at all. He studied philosophy alongside of it. And it's because of his knowledge of the approach of the classics, the methodology, the appreciation for philology above all, I think, that's to be found in the classics, because to be a classic scholar, you really have to know the languages. You know them well. You know where words come from. You know the stem meaning, the root, the derivations, the etymologies of words, how words develop over time. Those become essential, and you can't fake it. There's no faking in classics, which is why I liked it myself. Same thing as a medievalist, at least as an early medievalist, like a Tolkien medievalist, you're talking about Anglo-Saxon and Norse and languages that are dead, and you really, if you don't know the languages, you can't function. Whereas in modern language English literature, basically you don't have to know anything about anything, you just have to have an opinion. Which isn't to say that everyone who's in those fields is like that, but it allows for it, and the other almost forbids it. And I talked to you about Lewis's own background in terms of a sort of a battle within the, I'm not sure if a war is the right metaphor for it, but within the English department, the nascent English department at Oxford University, between the modernists who wanted to consider and include contemporary literature in the curriculum, and those like Tolkien and Lewis who wanted nothing after 1830 in the curriculum. And it's not because they didn't read it, they read it. And if you know anything about Lewis, he was very influenced by even contemporary writers like Dorothy Sayers and Chesterton, and Tolkien himself. Obviously he's reading Tolkien, and vice versa, they're reading one another's work, and they much appreciate it. And if you read Lewis, he is very William Wordsworth, a Romantic author, is one of his most influential mentors, if you will. And he's pre-1830, so but just on the cusp. So it's not about what they like per se, there's a certain objection to contemporary literature, and I do think it's related to that point that he made in De Descriptione Temporum. It's that there's this seismic shift come the mid-19th century, in the Victorian era, towards post-Christendom. And with post-Christendom, it's not just that they abandon Christianity, it's that they abandon the Tao, the moral law. They don't see it as determinative anymore. And I suggested to you that this is problematic, what they're saying here, because in Paul's letter to the Romans, he cites moral law as something that everyone understands. And they acknowledge it. Even though they don't have the law, he says, they act as if they had the law. When he says they don't have the law, he means they don't have the Torah, but they act as if they did. How do they do so? Because they can see the way things that are made, and they act in accordance with it. They have an acknowledgement of moral objectivity, as it were. The pagans do this. And when they do so, then they fulfill the law, when they walk in accordance with it. That's Paul's point. But what if, as is the case here, post-19th century, people dispute that the Tao operates? That's what he wrote about in The Abolition of Man. because that is the contemporary education situation, and it's one that we all grew up in. They deny what others, historically, other religions, other major religions, it's not just a Christian defense, Paul himself would have said about the pagans. So post-Christendom, which Lewis and Tolkien don't want to study, I think the primary reason for that is it's going into uncharted waters and it's moving away from the humanities altogether. Because if you don't have the Tao and you don't have the Christianization of the Tao, what do you have left? Other than the abolition of man. And you can't build the humanities on that. So it is a sort of a rearguard movement, if you will. And the Voyage of the Dawn Treader seems to me like a way of coming back at that topic again by depicting Eustace Scrubb as a progressive and his parents as progressives. They eat granola. I don't think they eat granola, but they eat something like that, right? They're very current and relevant. They wear certain types of underclothes. He talks about them. Sounds quite funny. You can imagine what their contemporary equivalents would be like just based on what he's describing them as. And they treat Eustace as an adult. They don't recognize a adult-child distinction. And you might say, that's great, they treat him like an adult, except that they don't see, and here's the point, they don't act like moral examples to him. There's no obedience, there's no hierarchy. And the hierarchy within the family is a reflection of their view of their own accountability to God, whom they don't believe in, of course, because they're progressive. Right? So there's a chain of consequences. Of course, because they believe in nothing above them, they don't, as a consequence, regard themselves as having any authority over their child. And that's progressive. And so Lewis is going to explore whether that is, and he does it by transporting this poor young boy, Eustace Scrubb, what a name. And I think Lewis said he deserved the name, which is additionally kind of funny. And draws him into this world which he doesn't believe in at all until he's literally over his head in water. And even then he doesn't believe it. And it is, as I say, it's an allegory of the church and what the church does, and to some degree, I guess, what it means when you walk into a church building and you are surrounded by, one presumes, although you don't know, Christians. Like, who else is there? Well, you're not a Christian and you're there, so that doesn't mean that the people there alongside you are either. And you don't know that. And if you're from the other side of it, the person who's speaking, the preacher, the vicar, the whatever, the priest, you don't know that the people there in the congregation are Christians either. You have no idea. Even if they come regularly, you don't know that. And yet there's a commitment. They do certain things corporately. There are certain rules, as it were, rites, rituals, a liturgy that they follow. And it's very strange to the people who just get drawn through the picture into the water. Note that the water that he falls into is not the water of baptism. I don't think it has anything to do with that. Because there's no profession of faith. He's not being dunked. Nobody's professing anything there. He's just drawn into it, and he's literally above his head. But notice how it also, and this is just a little detail, the children, the Pevensie children, love the picture. And Eustace hates the picture. Is it sublime? Is it just pretty? Eustace doesn't even think it's pretty, and neither does his family. They hate the portrait. And it comes down to an issue of taste there, which seems subjective, and yet it seems when you read Voyage of the Dawn Treader, there's a lot more weight being placed on his distaste than meets the eye. There's more there. And they find it disgusting that he doesn't like it either, and vice versa. There's a genuine distaste for one another, and you can see that friction between the two, particularly towards the children. I think Eustace is portrayed as a rotten little boy. Bit of a bully, and even more than a bit of a bully, contemptuous of those who don't share his point of view. You know, he's literally scornful of them for believing in this place called Narnia and a lion and adventures and so forth. And I think it's well done. It's realistic. This is the experience that people who come to faith will have of those who are progressives. Like, you believe in God, you like all of the things that we associate with Christian belief, miracles, conversion. He not only looks down his nose at it, he is openly contemptuous. And he does that very well. And for their part, they are children, and they're not trying to convert him. Right? They're not trying to convince him that Aslan is real. They just know that he is. And they feel offended that Eustace denies it. On the other hand, they know perfectly well that he can't have the knowledge that they have because he's never experienced it. But they're going to hold to it themselves. They're not going to deny this. This is as real as anything. And so it's interesting that Lewis presents this not in terms of an apologetic exercise on the children's behalf. There's no preaching going on here, even to Eustace. There's simply an insistence on the part of those who do know that Narnia is real, that it is real, and there is an unwavering commitment to that on the children's part. And as an effect of that, we notice the difference in behavior between the children and Eustace, and that's also interesting. And what's also interesting is within the company that's on the John Treader, there are different characters who treat Eustace rather differently. Like Reepicheep, for instance, wants to whoop him, give him a lesson. Lucy feels a little bit sorry for him and is willing to give her food to him, even though she has no rations. She's willing to give up her food to him. And of course, Eustace and says something along the line, well, boys are hungrier than girls and so forth. And then Eustace says, well, I always thought that, but now, and he's rationalizing it. He didn't think that. Nobody's ever thought that boys are hungrier than girls. I don't think anyone has ever thought that, but he wants to eat it, and he's rationalizing it. And the reader who's following Eustace's mind there is seeing the rationalization of selfish behavior. And likewise, they're seeing the rationalization of selfless behavior on behalf of the company. Even Reepicheep, who is a character of great honor, despite being of small stature, in the end is the kindest of all of the characters towards Eustace, the most compassionate. Even though he wants to whip him at first, in the end, I think Reepicheep shows extraordinary selflessness. And at the same time, the zeal of Reepicheep the mouse for Aslan and his kingdom is such that he will not relent. When everyone else wants to turn back, the mouse is the mouse that roars. Right? He is the heart of a lion. And that's not because he's perfect. We can see that he gets rebuked as well for his conduct. In fact, all of the characters get rebuked. So the characters that represent the church, the company of the John Treader, make errors, including Caspian himself, who wants to go into to follow Reepicheep up into the Aslan's country, and is turned back by them, and they say, you may not do this. You're not allowed as a king to abandon your duty. So this is a different comment, but it is a comment about responsibility. and different vocations even within the church. So this person may be called to glory and be drawn that way, and this may be acceptable. This person, the king, may wish to do so, but if he did so, he'd be neglecting his duty and abandoning his people to other risks, and the others gang up against him and say, you may not do so, including reap a sheep. It would be dishonorable for the king to do what I'm doing. So we get within the uniformity of the company, of the Dawn Treader Company, we get considerable diversity of what their specific vocation is and what they are to do within that. And at the same time, there's a uniformity of purpose. We're here to, there's a common mind, and yet there's differences individually within that. And their individuality it flourishes within that context. Whereas we get the sense with Eustace and his parents that for all of their progressiveness, there is an enormous uniformity of thought and action. They look down on the believers for being mindless, and yet nobody acts more mindlessly than they do. Because Eustace basically just regurgitates what he's been told. And he can't adapt to circumstances and situations. His judgment of everything is poor. And it's consistently, embarrassingly poor. I mean, he wants to turn Caspian and company over to the British consulate. And thinks that the mouse ought to be killed. And he's surprised to hear that the mouse has a position of high esteem among the ranks of this company. So again, we're seeing something of the reflection of looking not upon the surface here, but judging in accordance with moral character. That's why Eustace, that's what Eustace doesn't acknowledge, because everyone's equal in his world. We don't acknowledge a moral hierarchy. Whereas the biggest chested figure in the Voyage of the Dawn Treader is none other than Reap a Sheep. And Reap a Sheep will not accept turning back if it is for reasons of cowardice. He cannot accept that. So he sees no conflict between his virtue, the virtue of courage, and God's grace, which is drawing them towards the end of the world. He thinks that they must connect, and there's no contradiction there. It is wrong not to do the brave thing. I will not do that. He's not going to throw his life away on a pin for nothing, but he's also not, just because there's a threat there, going to agree with the others that they should turn back because it's got too hard. So he is not a man with a chest, but he is a beast with a chest. And again, represents a sort of a reformed or a whole man, if you will. The way a man ought to be. This is a manly mouse. Father used to say that to me as a boy. Are you a man or a mouse? Squeak up. Yeah, that's my dad. It's good. It's good. He's encouraging courage. Good thing. Stop whimpering. Don't cry. Whatever. You get that here. You would not get that in a model, progressive view of things. Manliness? How dare you? There's a difference between men and male and female virtue. Lewis clearly depicts it in his Narnia Chronicles, that there are commonalities, there are also differences between the two sexes, and he reinforces that it's a good thing. But not in and of themselves, but more because they are a picture of the way, if you go back to what I said last time when we were talking about the magician's nephew, about love being expressed even in the form of Aslan. He's the male face of Venus, if you will. Remember we talked about that a little bit? Aslan is a male lion, and yet in many ways he represents love expressed most fully like agape love. So he's the way Venus ought to be. Venus baptized, if you will. Whereas we saw that the Jadis was rather the opposite. Venus gone to seed, like Ishtar, the goddess of Babylon. And again, you can think of how those Babylon is portrayed in Scripture, and God's people are portrayed. The heavenly Jerusalem dressed like a bride, and then we have Babylon the Great, the whore. Right? Clear. And some find the female depiction objectionable. And I think they're missing the point there a little bit. It's not talking about women even. There's something more profound being addressed there. But it all begins with the picture in the bedroom. And that in itself is interesting. So what we find here, and what we found already, we found it with the magician's nephew, but it doesn't really help there because it's saying how we got to the point where we had a wardrobe built and the figure of uncle of the professor, Professor Diggory, and all of this, and the rings by which they get into the other worlds there is also the means by which we get there through the wardrobe, but now we find that even a picture in a bedroom can be a means there. But here it's more interesting because it's through the appreciation of art. I think that's the key point here, which touches exactly on what he talked about in The Abolition of Man. It was immediately about beauty, your perception of beauty. Is there any difference between it? Well, actually, yes, there is. And it's not that it's just a matter of indifference even, it's a matter of utmost importance. Lewis says that in The Abolition of Man. This is on this, the whole of education hangs. Is there such a thing as the sublime? Is there such a thing as the most beautiful thing? Or are these just mere feelings? And if you say that they're mere feelings, then it's just emotivism. It's irrational. And that's what is being suggested or implied by the authors of the Green Book, Titius and Gaius. It's just emotivism, subjectivism. Well, if you read any Lewis, you know that he is disagreeing with that because he writes against subjectivism and what he calls the personal fallacy or the personalist heresy even. Good book, by the way, there. But the picture in the bedroom is portraying something that is sublime. It draws the children, it reminds them of a better place. It has transcendence about it. It reminds them not of a place that they've been to. It's not a sense of reverie or nostalgia for the past. It's more than that. It reminds them of something higher than they. And this is very important for Lewis because the modern academy makes us reduce everything to something lower than us. And it dismisses something higher than us, but it says that we begin in something lower than us and we move upwards from that, hence the theory of evolution. It begins with something lower and then it issues forth into where we are. We are at the acme of history, at the point of it, and we're moving further up in that sense, but away from that. But we're at the top. There's no sense of anything above us. Whereas in Lewis's conception, goodness in its original state is the most good. And iterations of it thereafter are distortions, perversions, imitations, but lesser imitations of it. And so in the picture in the bedroom, he is actually portraying, I think, the very same sort of thing that he is talking about in The Abolition of Man, the idea of transcendence, sublimity, greatness, whatever in education as a model for us to imitate, and through what he calls the ordo amoris, the order of love, the hierarchy of love, We'll get to that when we come to the four loves. He suggests there aren't just four different types, there is an ordering of them, and each step is higher. And the one that is at the fourth step, the highest step, is actually unlike the others. And you don't get the other lower steps properly unless you have the higher step. And that's what's going to be displayed in Eustace Scrubb. Because he doesn't understand agape love, because he hasn't been born again, because he has sees everything as a consequence of lower primitive forces, he's effectively walking around like a scaly dragon, which eventually he's transformed into, because he's rich. And he's most miserable. So in a sense, what we're getting there with the portrait of the dragon, by the way, is what he will also display in the Great Divorce, which is if somebody doesn't want to be in heaven, because that's when we get to the Great Divorce, the idea is that people have died and now they find themselves in heaven. And they don't want to be there. They weren't ready for it. In fact, there's nothing in them that will allow them to appreciate what that heaven is. He's talking about you have to have the agape love to begin with in order to truly understand erotic love, to understand friendship, and even to understand and appreciate your family. Those portraits are there in Scripture, by the way, of the people of God as a family, the idea of being friends with God, the idea of being God's lovers. Those three are all there. But they are denatured unless you understand the grace of God first, and those then permeate and transform the lower forms. Otherwise, they all go amiss. And he portrays that in, as I say, the Great Divorce. But he does it here as well, with the picture in the bedroom. So I'll just begin with this. And it seems like an odd place to begin, but he begins with the man. He begins with Eustace. There was a boy called Eustace Clarence Scrubb, and he almost deserved it. His parents called him Eustace Clarence, and masters called him Scrubb. I can't tell you how his friends spoke to him, for he had none. He didn't call his father and mother, but Harold and Alberta. They were very up-to-date and advanced people. They were vegetarians, non-smokers, and teetotalers, and wore a special kind of underclothes. In their houses there was very little furniture and few clothes on beds, and the windows were always open so they can get fresh air. Eustace Clarence liked animals, especially beetles, if they were dead and pinned on a card. Take what we said in the Abolition of Man about the detachment and the power that comes with a certain type of scientific perspective. Now he's doing it to the animal world, but I think in that just that little portrait, he loves animals. He loves them when they're dead, and he can categorize them, and he can show his mastery over them, and he can order them. It's a very subtle, I don't know if it's that subtle, but it's saying more in a sentence than appears to be said. He liked books if they were books of information and had pictures of grain elevators or fat foreign children doing exercises in model schools. Eustace Clarence disliked his cousins, the four Pevensies, Peter, Susan, Edmund, and Lucy. But he was quite glad when he heard that Edmund and Lucy were coming to stay, for deep down inside him he liked bossing and bullying. And though he was a puny little person who couldn't have stood up even to Lucy, let alone Edmund, in a fight, he knew that there are dozens of ways to give people a bad time if you're in your own home, and they are only visitors. And you can think of children like this immediately. This is the beauty of writing about children, is that children's experience is pretty common. Adult experience, there can be differences there. As an adult, there are some things I've not experienced and I can't identify with them. But children's experience is pretty common in this sense. And we immediately recognize in Eustace that sort of little cowardly bully who takes advantage of situations to make people miserable and takes pleasure in it, if not a sort of sadistic delight, just like the Beatles. So he goes from the Beatles to talking about he relates to his own flesh and blood. And so again, a lot being said here at the beginning. Edmund and Lucy did not want at all to come and stay with Uncle Harold and Aunt Alberta, but it really couldn't be helped. Father had got a job lecturing in America for 16 weeks that summer, and Mother was to go with him because she hadn't had a real holiday for 10 years. Peter was working very hard for an exam. By the way, I'm wondering if Lewis is secretly judging the parents for this. I think he is. Peter was working very hard for an exam, and he was to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk. By the way, remember, Lewis is left without a mother, and his father sends him away to a boarding school because the circumstances are such that he can't look after the boys. He does what's best for him. I think Lewis, the adult, understands what his father had to do. At the same time, the children are being put in a situation which they are not happy about. Lewis knows what it's like to be an unhappy child. But Peter's working very hard for an exam, and he was to spend the holidays being coached by old Professor Kirk, Diggory, in whose house these 4 children had had wonderful adventures long ago in the war years. If he had still been in that house, he would have had them all to stay. Kirk would have. But he had somehow become poor since the old days and was living in a small cottage with only 1 bedroom to spare. It would have cost too much money to take the other 3 all to America, and so only Susan had gone. Grown-ups thought her the pretty one of the family, and she was no good at schoolwork, though otherwise very old for her age. And Mother said, quote, she would get far more out of a trip to America than the youngsters. Edmund and Lucy tried not to grudge Lucy her luck, but it was dreadful having to spend the summer holidays at their aunt's. But it's far worse for me, said Edmund, because you'll at least have a room of your own, and I shall have to share a bedroom with that record stinker, Eustace. So there's the backdrop. The story begins, he says, there you go. But that's the backdrop. But in the backdrop, we get a lot there about family relations, about growing up, about the ordering of their loves, their priorities, about being a child and put in a situation where the adults who are to look after you have effectively left you in a situation which you're probably not happy with and really not up to handling. Very realistic situation for many people. So it's very interesting in that sense. And I don't think, and here's what's interesting, I've repeatedly said this, and some of you have heard me talk about this, in modern fiction, there's a repeated dependency on the idea of the orphan as the hero. And what we get in those as well is, those narratives, is a reference to some sort of superpower within the kids, which they have to draw upon in order to make the right decisions. So Harry Potter, even Dumbledore can't tell Harry Potter what he should do. Harry will know himself. Spider-Man, Superman, they all have to go to and look within themselves for counsel, for wisdom on how to act. Is that what Lewis is doing here? Because the children are being left effectively abandoned, right? They're on their own, and they're with adults that are not helpful. Are there no role models here? Is there somebody to imitate here other than themselves? And the answer is yes. So I don't think that even though it has the form of an orphan novel, I think that he is actually speaking against the typical orphan novel in the way that the children are directed. And the children are not always right. And in fact, the children have role models that they trust and look up to and correct them. And in fact, they're often wrong. They have models of virtue which they aspire to. So the children don't stop being children. So I would say, and I've never written on this, but it would be an interesting thing to write on, that the Lewis is actually not only, so in his science fiction, I think he's writing against atheist science fiction. We'll get to that next semester if you're with me. But here I think he's writing on children's fiction, which tends to have orphans in them, orphans who are set against the adults with no good examples, in which the child is the hero on the child's own merits. That's not what we have here, I don't think. But they are in this room, and they look at the picture, and a little bit of poetry comes out there as well. Eustace says it's a rotten picture. Edmund says you won't see it if you step outside. And then Eustace asks Lucy, why do you like it? And she says, well, for one thing, I like it because the ship looks as if it were really moving. And the water looks as if it were really wet. And the waves look as if they were really going up and down. And what she sees is something that eventually becomes true. But she sees it before it is so. It's a way of looking at the world. Do you see the transcendent in the immanent? Do you see heaven in the earth? Do you see that? It's a prayer, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Can you already see the answer to the prayer in the world around you in certain ways? Is there a sort of sense of expectancy or hope? She can see it in this painting. And then the painting starts moving and the water starts pouring in. They get pulled into the other world and so forth, as we know. But it's rather extraordinary how it happens. And note that they are all drawn in, though, including the one who denies that the place even exists. And they get dragged on board by Caspian, and he's surprised to find Eustace in their company, who is this fellow. So when he gets through, then they start to come to terms with who he is. And of course, he is not just a cousin, he's a rotter. He's an absolute stinker of a kid. They go on a variety of voyages, and the voyages are interesting, probably plucked from Greek literature. And probably deserving better treatment than I'm going to give them today. But one of the places that they go to, which I think is interesting, is, first of all, they go to a place where slavery. They're going to find the 7 voyagers, right? This is Caspian's call, to find the men who had preceded him and had gone off on voyages and trying to find these men. And where the first place he goes lands them all in slavery. And this is very interesting. What does a Narnian do with the institution of slavery? Because when you think about it, the ancient world, and you think Narnia, you think of it, it's sort of got a medieval setting. There's a lot of medieval values. There's sort of knights and literally dragons in it. There are those sorts of characters there. It seems to be set in the distant past. In the distant past, as we know, slavery existed. It was an institution in the ancient world. It was an institution through much of human history. And it's crept back into Narnia of all places. What is Caspian going to do when he comes across the institution of slavery? That, to me, is a fascinating passage, because he's not going to tolerate it at all. It will not exist here. But note that now we're talking about Narnia. We're not talking about this world. We're talking about Narnia, a place where we think there's a sort of a perfection, and yet the perfection is something that they drive forward. They have to push back the darkness. They have to push back wickedness. And that's exactly what they do here. Is they get rid of the institution of slavery, and they reimpose the penalty of death for those that do it. That had been allowed to lapse. Very interesting. Lewis is writing in the early 20th century. It was only 100 years before that the institution of slavery was abolished in the British Empire by William Wilberforce, among other things, among other characters. And Lewis is aware that many accuse Christians of tolerating slavery. And so what's he going to say about it here? Is it just part of the past? And Lewis shows himself a true progressive by saying, no, this will not be tolerated. It's not just the way things are done here. And gets rid of this. And with that then sets off on the voyage. Now where does this come of it? Well, they end up in a storm, and they end up with Eustace wandering off on his own. And this is very important, because it's at that point that Eustace is allowed to act in accordance with his desires and be free from the enslavement of the ship representing, I've said, the church. He wanders off. And what did they do with that? Because they can't stand the guy. Nobody likes Eustace. And yet the whole of the ship is willing, albeit grudgingly, because this is a real pain, to go and risk themselves to go get Eustace. They go after him, right? And then Eustace finds himself in the body of a dragon. This is a very interesting passage, actually. Where is this when I'm not sure I'm going to find this, where his reaction to the gold and so forth, but he imagines himself rich and powerful, and he imagines himself, I believe, as a king and being able to order the others around. So immediately the progressive, when he has sufficient wealth, finds that he's no longer committed to being an egalitarian after all. He is going to show those others what it's like. I'll skip over the fight between him and Reepicheep, which I really take great delight in. But he puts on the gold, whatever it is, I guess a bracelet of some sort on his arm, and that transforms him in his sleep into this dragon, and at that point he can't get this gold off his arm. He can't remove it. Now there's symbolism in that as well. The lust of his eyes ends up being a pain in the flesh. And it's a pain in the flesh that he can't remove. No one can get it off him until they come along and Aslan comes. And then when Aslan meets him, one of the things that he is going to have to do is he wants the skin taken away. How do we do this? And the answer is, I have to go very deep. And the question is it going to hurt? What was the answer to the question? The answer is most certainly yes, but I think it's going to hurt a lot more than you think it's going to hurt. It's going to be extraordinarily painful. But that's the only way of removing the dragon's scales. It's through suffering, through pain. This is going to be a consistent feature of Lewis's reflection on suffering, the meaning and purpose of suffering in God's purposes. There is suffering, but God also uses suffering for good. So I think that Eustace was always of the dragon. That's his sort of eschatology, if you will. He is ultimately he already is a dragon in his thinking, and he becomes what he already was. In his dreams, he wakes up and he is what he always wanted to be. He wanted power, he wanted gold and treasure. And the only way to be released from that commitment of the heart is to be given a new commitment. And you can't do that on your own. And that's the interesting thing here. Again, Eustace is not converted through speaking. He is converted through the work of Aslan in pain, pulling the old self off of him. Literally tearing it off. But before that, and this is also interesting, Eustace makes himself known, and he comes to the aid of the company in fighting off the sea monster, and is suddenly willing to, and he doesn't want to leave the company of the Dawn Treader, whom he despised before and wanted nothing more than to be rid of these horrid people. Accused them of all sorts of things. Now he doesn't want to be away from them. He's flying after them. And he even sacrifices himself very bravely. And it's interesting to see that his bravery is almost like a first step towards the grace. Because he's sacrificing himself. He's literally putting himself at mortal risk, which he never would have done before. He won't even fight against a mouse. Remember, Repeat draws and says, will you give me satisfaction? No, I'm not going to do that. It's barbaric. I'm not going to get into a fight. What sort of place is this where men, boys, anyone has to fight? We're more civilized than that. Again, a certain view of love and war there as well in the whole discussion. Again, Lewis is not a pacifist. He's not a warmonger either. He just thinks that there are certain conditions under which you must fight to preserve the greater good. And it seems like Eustace thinks there's no conditions under which you should ever have to fight. It's uncivilized. And he says that because he's a coward. He has no chest. But now he's drawn by his love of the company because the company was kind to him. They treated him with kindness. And the kindness of the company gives him a heart that he didn't have before, or guts that he didn't have. That's interesting. He's drawn by his love. It's not just because he's lonely. He actually is drawn by the compassion shown to him, the care. I mean, Lucy puts a little drop of the cordial to heal the wound on him. Most compassionate, and they care about him. They express their care towards him. And it's the care, just the little acts of kindness by the company of the Dawn Treader that convince Eustace to be brave for the first time. His parents it appears, didn't love him. They informed him. But they showed no grace or compassion towards him. And now he experiences it, and the result of that is he grows in courage. And I don't think that comes from him. It comes from the company. It's the witness, the gracious witness of the company that changes Eustace before he gets the skin ripped off, which is a divine act of God, if you will. But it's certainly the claws of the lion. Only the lion can do this. Yes, but there's a preparatory to that, and that's the small acts of kindness by the company. That's how I see it. That's how I see this passage. So it's not that there's no connection between the small acts of familiarity and friendship towards Eustace and what Aslan ends up doing. I think they're interconnected. But it's clear that only Aslan can do what ends up being done. What else should I talk about here? The three sleepers are interesting. So is the beginning of the end of the world. It's particularly interesting. The old man who's a star and whose daughter is a star. That is also interesting, particularly if you look at what Lewis writes about stars and the importance of stars in, say, Dante's Divine Comedy, where every canticle, each of the three parts concludes with the word stelle, stars, and their representation as sorts of angels. Well, he is a sort of an angel, and this is a messianic banquet. The banquet's there. They're worried that the food is what caused the three sleepers to sleep, right? Don't eat the food, because remember, they see the man who's dived into the water and is turned into gold. And so maybe this is another thing like that, where we're being tempted by something and we shouldn't do it. But in this case, it isn't. It's very different. But there are all sorts of those situations. Another one is the book in which Lucy starts reading and sees herself in that book and sees herself as Susan, whom she admires as beautiful and wishes she were other than she is. And she starts transforming and becoming actually more dragon-like is what's going on there. Becomes dislikable. And that's from a desire within her. And then she sees, in the midst of that book, suddenly she sees the face of Aslan and he's angry. And that scares her back. And you would say, well, what's the relation between Aslan being terrifying and Aslan being loving? And the answer is to scare her away from her sin, and which is an act of grace. Because that would be a worse outcome for her, to let her have what she wanted and be transformed into a dragon. He's not going to allow that. But what holds the Narnian lords asleep, chapter 14? The old man says, to break the enchantment, you must sail to the world's end, or as near as you can come to it, and you must come back having left at least one of your company behind. And what must happen to that one? Asked Reepicheep. He must go on into the utter east and never return into the world. That is my heart's desire, said Reepicheep. It's an immediate response. What's going to happen to that one? Well, he's going to go there and never come back. And are we near, and the rest of them, there's already an established relationship between Reepicheep and the rest of them. And like, oh, Reepicheep. Not afraid of anything, zealous in every way, at the front of every conflict, but also the least suitable to this world, and really a saint, really, in their company. And are we at the world's end now, sir? Said Caspian. Have you any knowledge of the seas and lands further east than this? I saw them long ago, said the old man, but it was from a great height. I cannot tell you such things as sailors need to know. Do you mean you were flying in the air? Eustace blurted out. I was a long way above the air, my sons, replied the old man. I am Ramandu. But I see that you stare at one another and have not heard this name. And no wonder, for the days when I was a star had ceased long before any of you knew this world, and all the constellations have changed. Golly, said Edmund under his breath. He's a retired star. Aren't you a star any longer, said Lucy. I am a star at rest, my daughter, said Ramandu. When I set for the last time, decrepit and old beyond all that you can reckon, I was carried to this island. I am not so old now as I was then, because he's being renewed. Everything's being renewed. Each morning, a bird brings me a fireberry from the valleys in the sun, and each fireberry takes away a little of my age. And when I have become as old as the child that was born yesterday, then I shall take my rising again. For we are at earth's eastern rim, and once more tread the great dance. Now, this theme of the great dance is a theme that he will pick up in the work Paralandra. It's a reference to the relations of the Trinity, regarded as a cosmic dance. The relations of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, a perichoresis, the great dance. He depicts it at the end of Paralandra, which is about planet Venus, as a way in which love is elevated to its full significance. There's a progress to it. Likewise, here in this world of Narnia, which only represents the real Narnia. Remember, this is an image of that. It's not the real Narnia, because that's why they're going out of the world. They're going to the place that is that, where in the last battle they'll go further up and further in, and say the reason the old Narnia, we loved it so is it reminded us of this place, which we've not yet been to. In the same way, the perichoresis is a great celebration. It's a festival. There's a banquet. There's a banquet here. He's being renewed at this banquet. It's if you see at the table there, it might be like communion. The fireberries are renewing him. He's being renewed. And this is a great way of encapsulating in a neat little phrase the difference between Lewis's view and the progressive view. The progressive view says, behold, we're making all new things. And Lewis is saying, the Christian way is saying it, that God says, behold, I'm making all things new. I'm renewing them. I'm not making new things, I'm renewing things that are already there. And it starts with you renewing it, but it also includes the whole heavens and earth. Right? It's not destroyed. That idea of the destruction of the cosmos is unbiblical. It's the restoration and renewal of everything that God created, which he called good. He's not going to destroy the good. He's not going to let sin and death destroy what he's called good. He's going to restore what's been lost and perverted. That's what's going on. And here at this table, this star, which has been affected by the fall, stars will also lose their energy, regains his energy. He will flame forth and be part of the constellation. Note that it's a star, just like, again, in the discarded image is the cosmology. Okay, so you're getting the point. He will go back to being as full of light as he once was. He's not moving right now, but he will move again when everything is moving and everything is involved in acts of worship. And Eustace still speaks like the old Eustace in response. In our world, said Eustace, a star is a huge ball of flaming gas. That's sort of a dictionary definition. And he responds, even in your world, my son, that is not what a star is, but only what it is made of. And in this world you have already met a star, for I think you have been with Koryakin. Is he a retired star too? Said Lucy. Well, not quite the same, said Ramandu. It was not quite as a rest that he was set to govern, as a rest that he was set to govern the Duffers. You might call it a punishment. He might have shone for thousands of years more in the southern winter sky if it had all gone well. What did he do, sir? Asked Caspian. My son, said Ramandu, it is not for you, a son of Adam, to know what faults a star can commit. But come, we waste time in such talk. Are you yet resolved? Will you sail further east and come again, leaving one to return no more, and so break the enchantment? Or will you sail westward? Surely, sire, said Reepicheep, there is no question about that. It is very plainly part of our quest to rescue these three lords from enchantment. I think the same, Reepicheep replied Caspian, and even if it were not so, it would break my heart not to go as near the world's end as the Dawn Treader will take us. But I am thinking of the crew. They signed on to seek the seven lords, not to reach the rim of the earth. If we sail east from here, we sail to find the edge, the utter east, and no one knows how far it is. They're brave fellows, but I see signs that some of them are weary of the voyage and long to have our prow pointing to Narnia. I don't think I should take them further without their knowledge and consent. And then there's the poor Lord Roop. He's a broken man. My son, said the star, it would be no use, even though you wished it, to sail for the world's end with men unwilling or men deceived. Now, if I'm correct in saying this is about the church, there's no point in going onward with people who are not fully committed, who have not, of their own volition, said, I am for this. I know the cost. There's no point in doing this. This is not going to avail you anything. You can compel people in. They can be there without realizing it. It's not going to avail anything to get where you want to go. They have to know and consent. That is not how great unenchantments are achieved. Isn't that interesting? This is an unenchantment. It's not a magic act. The magic act was in putting people to sleep, committing them to sin and death. That's the enchantment. We've got to break the enchantment. We've already seen that the deeper magic breaks enchantments. When Aslan himself put himself on the stone table, and if the witch had only known that there was a deeper magic that would undo all of these things. Well, that's what, again, same thing being talked about here, right? They must know where they go and why. For who is this broken man you spoke of? And Caspian told Ramandu the story of Rup. I can give him what he needs most, said Ramandu. In this island there is sleep without stint or measure, and sleep in which no faintest footfall of a dream was ever heard. Let him sleep beside these other three and drink oblivion till your return. Note that Rup is a man who has mental health concerns to the point where he is broken. He's utterly broken. There's a recognition that you don't place upon him the same ardors or tasks, afflictions, as you will, the able-bodied. There's a place for a fight in Lewis's understanding of the church. There's also a place for people to be healed. And they're not lesser for it. He's done his task. He's been broken. Let him rest. Give him peace. And I will look after it, and you will go on. And in the end, Rup will be restored as well. But he's not for this fight. He's not made for it. He's clearly played his role. You each don't have all the same role. And one of you, at least, will go forward beyond this, but not all of you. I think that's interesting. Again, he's commenting, Lewis is, on the differences within the body of the church, in vocation, in situation, etc. Very interesting. Let me move forward because I'm going to run out of time here. The very end of the world. Because as I say, Caspian says that he's going to go with Rinpoche as well. And now we get the final thing I wanted to say about the abolition of man, because it talked about the thumos, the men with chests. You could be mistaken in thinking that all you need is a chest that's big enough to measure up. But that's not what's being suggested here. There are duties and obligations that are laid upon us that are going to result in different vocations and so forth. But this is at the very end of the world, and I won't give you the line number because it won't matter. You have different pages. But he says, Caspian says, to you, my lord Drinian, I entrust this ship, bidding you sail to Narnia with all the speed you may, and above all not to land on the island of Deathwater, and instruct my regent, the dwarf Trumpkin, to give to all these, my shipmates, the rewards I promised them. They have been earned well. But if I come not again, it is my will that the regent, the master, and Master Cornelius, and Truffle Hunter the Badger, and the Lord Drinian choose a king of Narnia with the consent. But sire, interrupted Drinian, are you abdicating? I am going with Rinpoche to see the world's end, said Caspian. A low murmur of dismay ran through the sailors. Now this is surprising. Is everyone not supposed to want to be with Aslan right then, as soon as they can be? Are they not? Is it not an expression of the valor of Rinpoche that he wants to? And the answer is clearly no. It's not only that. There's something else there that's drawing Rinpoche. It's Aslan drawing him. And that's not the calling upon Caspian, and the reason we know that is because Caspian has a duty which, if he abdicates and abandons, will result in harm to others. It's not his time yet. By the way, we'll see Caspian after the last battle. We will see him there, but it's not yet. And a low murmur of dismay rose, and Edmund says, Caspian, you can't do this. Most certainly, said Rinpoche, His Majesty cannot. No, indeed, said Drinian. Can't, said Caspian sharply, looking for a moment, not unlike his uncle Miraz, the dragon, right? Something, begging your Majesty's pardon, said Rheinelf from the deck below, but if one of us did the same, it would be called deserting. You presume too much on your long service, Rheinelf, said Caspian. No, sire, he's perfectly right, said Drinian. By the mane of Aslan, said Caspian, I thought you were all my subjects here, not my schoolmasters. I'm not, said Edmund, and I say you cannot do this. Can't again, said Caspian. What do you mean? If it please your Majesty, we mean shall not said Reepicheep with a very low bow. You are the king of Narnia. You break faith with all your subjects, and especially Trumpkin if you do not return. You shall not please yourself with adventures as if you were a private person. And if your majesty will not hear reason, it will be the truest loyalty of every man on board to follow me in disarming and binding you till you come to your senses. Quite right, said Edmund. Is this a mutiny? I mean, looks in the form like a mutiny. Everyone against the leader, but the leader is abdicating his responsibility. In Romans 13, it talks about obeying those in positions of authority. Right? It talks about that. And it's presented quite starkly, even if they're not Christians. You're to obey them because they bear the sword, and they don't do so in vain. They're there to punish injustice, etc. But there is an instance in which unjust leadership, and particularly those that abdicate their own sense of responsibility to and duty to God, should be turned against. And note that how it's done. It's not, you have no right. It's with a bow towards them, and with all due respect, Your Majesty, until you come to your senses, we're going to say no. You may not do this. And they're not denying that he's the king. They don't chop off his head. This isn't a Charles I moment. They're not at that stage yet. But they are saying, we will not allow you to do what you normally are used to doing, which is having your way, because your way is actually wicked. So they oppose him on the grounds of wickedness. And the wickedness is shown forth in terms of disloyalty to his own subject. Faithlessness, in fact, they say. You're not being faithful. And there's a continuity between faithfulness to the people that serve you and your act of faithfulness towards them. So there's a compatibility there. I think that's very interesting. In the end, they go up, and they go up in the water this time, but further up. And the sense of going up, and they go so high that we'll see the same sort of thing being replicated in the last battle. But very interesting. The idea of the ends of the world. Lewis said that nobody in the Middle Ages thought that the earth was flat, like nobody, and yet something like that is being portrayed here as a fiction. And it's because it is just that. It's a fiction. It's an idea of going to a place that you can't describe, to a transcendent place. Well, it's the same sense of going through a picture or through a wardrobe or whatever. You can't go anywhere by going through a picture either there. But it's an imaginative construct, and that's what it represents there. He's not saying that the world is actually flat, although it is as flat as the picture that he went through to get into the world. That's it. Okay? We'll see you next time. We'll do the silver chair next time, okay?